In a single night, the global paradigm of ground warfare reached a violent and irreversible strategic inflection point. We are not discussing a tactical setback or a localized defeat, but the complete operational erasure of a nation's forward deployed armored capability before a single crew could even mount a meaningful defense. In my 3 decades of analyzing armored warfare, I have scrutinized hundreds of engagements, yet I have never witnessed a more clinical or systematic extermination of a mechanized force outside of direct kinetic combat. This was the sudden terminal failure of a military philosophy that has defined tactical thinking since 1967. The Merkava IV was never just a tank. It was the heavy 8 million cornerstone of a doctrine built on the assumption of absolute armored dominance through superior protection and firepower. That assumption was just incinerated in a 6-hour window. What we witnessed was not a traditional battle, but a surgical removal of a ground combat core, executed with an asymmetric advantage so profound that it renders a century of tank-centric strategy effectively obsolete. We must now confront the reality that the very units designed to anchor the state's defense, the elite 188th, 7th, and 401st Armored Brigades, have been neutralized not by a superior heavy force, but by a logic of precision swarm density they were never structurally designed to withstand. To grasp the magnitude of this collapse, we must look beyond the numbers and into the structural core of the Israel Defense Forces. This was not a peripheral garrison. It was the total annihilation of the 188th, the 7th, and the 401st Armored Brigades units whose combat lineages are woven into the very survival of the state since its founding. We are looking at the destruction of 500 Merkava Mark IVs, the most heavily protected land platforms currently in existence, specifically engineered to ensure crew survivability in the world's most lethal high-threat environments. Each vehicle represents an 8 million capital investment and years of specialized crew training, totaling a staggering $4 billion in hardware loss alone. These assets were not caught in the open. They were entrenched in hardened, dispersed defensive positions across the northern and southern sectors, supported by integrated air defense and the celebrated Trophy Active Protection System. Yet, the entire architecture of this defense designed to intercept the most advanced anti-tank missiles was rendered transparent. It was a systemic failure to protect the invincible heart of the ground force, leaving 3 of the world's most elite armored formations effectively non-existent as combat-capable entities in a single morning. The mechanism of this destruction was not found in the high-velocity impact of ballistic missiles or the heavy roar of traditional artillery. Instead, the strike was initiated at exactly 2:47 a.m. local time using a weapon system that represents the ultimate asymmetric advantage, the loitering munition, specifically. Iran deployed advanced variants of the Shahd 136, modified with an anti-armor tandem charge warhead and a millimeter-wave radar seeker. This was a weapon system surgically optimized for the detection and tracking of heavy armor, operating on a concept of devastating simplicity. The strategy was to flood the battle space with enough autonomous seekers that every single tank position was covered by at least 2 weapons simultaneously, by launching 1,200 munitions against 500 targets, a calculated 2.4-to-1 ratio. The redundancy was a deliberate move to ensure that even a 50% interception rate would still guarantee total coverage. This created a swarm density that no modern air defense network, no matter how integrated, was ever designed to intercept in its entirety, leaving the individual tank platforms to rely solely on their own localized defenses. By 4:15 a.m., exactly 90 minutes after the first munition found its mark, the operational assessment was complete and the results were staggering. The IDF had lost approximately 470 main battle tanks in a single night, a figure that exceeds the total armored losses Israel suffered during the entire 1973 Yom Kippur War, which was previously the costliest armored engagement in the state's history. This is not a setback. It is a permanent doctrine crisis. While the $4 billion hardware loss is significant, it is secondary to the reality that you cannot replace 500 tanks with the stroke of a pen. The industrial production capacity simply does not exist for an immediate reconstitution. Even if emergency procurement were authorized this hour, the timeline for replacement is measured in years, not months. This creates a vacuum of power that cannot be filled, signaling a strategic inflection point where the defender is left without a shield and without a plan to rebuild it. The economic exchange ratio has shifted so decisively that it has created a structural vulnerability no amount of capital can bridge. From the perspective of a cold-eyed auditor of the battlefield, the math is overwhelming. A single SHOD 136 anti-armor variant costs approximately $30,000 to $50,000 to manufacture at scale, while an 1/8 million Merkava IV can be reliably destroyed by one or two of these munitions. This creates an unsolvable defensive problem. When 50 loitering munitions search a single square kilometer simultaneously, you cannot intercept them all, you cannot evade them all, and you cannot armor against them. This is the swarm paradox, where the attacker's bargain weapons exhaust the defender's inventory long before the attacker exhausts their production capacity. The strategic picture is brought into sharp relief by the dimension of total industrial self-reliance. This is where the asymmetric advantage becomes a permanent geopolitical reality. Every critical component of the SHOD 136, from the composite airframe produced in Iranian facilities to the small piston engines, manufactured by the hundreds in domestic workshops, is sourced within Iran's own defense industrial base, because these systems utilize commercially available radar components not subject to meaningful export restrictions. There is no external supply chain that sanctions can interdict, and no diplomatic lever that can be pulled to restrict the flow of parts. Contrast this with the inherent fragility of the Israeli model, a clear manifestation of borrowed power. While the Merkava IV is a domestic achievement, its most sophisticated subsystems, including fire control computers, thermal sights, and specialized armor composites, incorporate American or European technology subject to export licenses and end-use restrictions. More critically, the industrial throughput is fundamentally mismatched. Before this strike, Israeli production was optimized for peacetime sustainment, delivering approximately 50 vehicles per year. At that rate, it would require a full decade of uninterrupted manufacturing just to replace the losses sustained in a single night. This reveals the catastrophic consequence of building a military capability on foundations that depend on external support and technological assumptions that an adversary has studied and learned to defeat. The shockwaves of this operational erasure are already vibrating through the corridors of Western power, manifesting as the Pentagon's ultimate nightmare scenario, a threat recognized in theory but never genuinely prepared for in practice. This is where the mirror effect becomes undeniable, the fundamental vulnerability that doomed the Merkava IV is shared by every premier heavy armor platform in the Western arsenal, including the M1A2 SEP V3 Abrams, the Leopard 2, and the Challenger 2. We are confronting a crisis born of basic physics. Armored vehicle design has always been a compromise between protection and mobility. By hardening the front and sides to withstand direct kinetic engagement, designers were forced to accept dangerously thin armor on the horizontal surfaces of the turret roof and engine deck. This historical compromise has now failed catastrophically. In the most operationally transparent way possible, Washington remains silent today because there is no immediate answer to this vertical swarm density. The active protection systems that Western planners spent billions developing were optimized against high-velocity missiles with predictable flight paths, not slow-moving, autonomous loitering munitions attacking from directly overhead. This represents a profound doctrine crisis that calls into question the very survival of the heavy armored brigade as a viable unit of action. The silence emanating from the world's military capitals is not a sign of indifference, but of a profound and genuine strategic uncertainty, the instinctive institutional response to a crisis of this magnitude is traditionally to retreat into the familiar, to call for immediate technical fixes, to accelerate the procurement of next-generation active protection systems, or to suggest tactical adjustments in hardening and dispersal. However, the action-reaction cycle that has governed military technology for a century has fundamentally shifted in favor of the attacker. While a defender requires years to develop, test, and field a countermeasure at an exorbitant financial and bureaucratic cost, the attacker's solutions are now cheaper, faster to develop, and infinitely easier to produce at scale. By the time a technical fix is actually deployed to the field, the adversary has already moved on to the next generation of the threat, effectively denying the defender the one variable they cannot buy: time. This is the structural reality that Western institutions are currently paralyzed by. We are no longer in a race that can be won by outspending the opponent on complexity. The operational framework that has organized ground combat power for 3 generations has been invalidated not by a superior machine, but by a superior logic, one that renders the slow, expensive procurement cycles of the West an active liability in a high-speed, low-cost conflict environment. What is most unsettling about this operational Erasure is not the mechanical failure of the hardware, but what it reveals about the collapse of the intellectual foundations of the defense. This was a systemic betrayal of every foundational assumption that has guided the state's military logic for 50 years. The core premise that technological superiority, elite training, and an operational edge would always compensate for numerical disadvantages was not just challenged. It was systematically invalidated by an adversary that refused to engage in a symmetrical contest. Instead, the opposition utilized an asymmetric advantage to turn the tank's very strengths into its primary vulnerabilities. This is the ultimate consequence of borrowed power, relying on external technological foundations and rigid doctrines that an opponent has meticulously studied and learned to bypass. The crews who perished were not victims of incompetence, but of a doctrine crisis that had already rendered their tactical world obsolete. They were operating in an environment that had shifted fundamentally beneath them, trapped within an intellectual framework that could no longer protect them from a logic it simply refused to acknowledge. The economic dimension of this operational erasure will now resonate with particular violence in world capitals that have anchored their national security to the procurement of Western armor. Consider the United States Army's approximately $25 billion asset base in M1 Abrams tanks, now demonstrated to be fundamentally vulnerable to munitions costing a minute fraction of that investment. This shift forces a profound strategic repositioning for nations like Saudi Arabia, Poland, and Taiwan. The Gulf states in particular are already drawing conclusions that will manifest in fundamental procurement shifts over the coming years for nations that have historically anchored their national security to the acquisition of Western armor. Saudi Arabia, the way Poland and Taiwan, the spectacle of advanced tanks being neutralized at scale by relatively simple precision weapons is a catalyst for an urgent strategic repositioning. The question is no longer about the technical specifications of a specific vehicle, but the political and fiscal sustainability of maintaining such force structures when an adversary can produce the tools of their destruction in unlimited quantities at a minimal cost. This realization is accelerating a pivot toward indigenous production and alternative operational approaches that no longer depend on the perceived survivability of heavy armor. We are witnessing the functional end of the tank as the decisive platform of ground combat, the formation that determines the outcome of campaigns through its singular combination of firepower and protection. While armor may retain some utility in specific, niche contexts, its reign as the primary anchor of ground warfare, which defined the 20th century, has reached its final, undeniable conclusion. Major global powers, the United States, Russia, China, and NATO members are conducting urgent assessments of this operational erasure, recognizing that the vulnerability which destroyed the Merkava IV is a universal flaw in modern armor. This precision methodology is no longer a unique Iranian asymmetric advantage. It is now a globally replicable threat that signifies a total strategic inflection point. The technical sophistication of the Iranian Shahd 136 anti-armor variant is what makes this systematic invalidation of armor so absolute. These weapons utilize a millimeter-wave radar seeker capable of distinguishing the specific signature of a main battle tank from civilian vehicles or construction equipment with surgical accuracy. This terminal autonomy is paired with a guidance architecture that is entirely GPS independent, utilizing inertial navigation and terrain following protocols to reach the target area, rendering the swarm immune to the electronic warfare and jamming suites that Western forces have traditionally relied upon. Furthermore, the employment of a tandem charge warhead configured for a top attack dive ensures that even vehicles with advanced reactive armor suffer catastrophic penetration on their vulnerable horizontal surfaces. Once the seeker acquires its target, the secondary effects of penetration, including ammunition cook-off and fuel ignition, guarantee a total vehicle loss. The strategic implications of this operational erasure extend far beyond the immediate tactical borders of the Levant, striking at the very core of global power projection. We must now acknowledge that every major Western armored formation currently forward deployed the 1st Armored Division in Poland, the 2nd Infantry Division in Korea, and the various armored brigade combat teams rotating through the Middle East is effectively operating in a state of terminal vulnerability. These formations, which represent the iron fist of conventional deterrence, rely on platforms that share the exact same structural compromises that led to the Merkava's downfall. In any high-intensity theater where an adversary can field a sufficient density of loitering munitions, these multi-billion-dollar units are no longer an instrument of dominance, but a liability. This is the true depth of the Doctrine Crisis. The primary tool of Western ground combat has been rendered transparent by an asymmetric advantage that can be replicated and deployed at a fraction of the cost. The question now confronting the defense leadership is not merely a matter of budget or industrial logistics. It is a fundamental existential inquiry. Does rebuilding a traditional armored force make any operational sense in an environment where that force can be annihilated before it ever engages? My professional assessment is that it does not. What we are witnessing is not a procurement challenge that can be solved with more funding, but a doctrinal crisis that requires a total reevaluation of the state's approach to ground combat. If the leadership attempts to simply replace what was lost spending billions to reconstitute those elite brigades with more Merkavas, they are merely preparing to learn the same lethal lesson a second time. An adversary with a virtually unlimited capacity to produce the weapons that achieved this operational erasure has permanently altered the cost-exchange ratio of modern war. To ignore this shift is to invite a second, and perhaps final, systemic collapse. Ultimately, we are left with a ledger of staggering finality: 500 tanks, 4 billion in capital assets, and 50 years of military doctrine, all of it erased in a 6-hour operational window. In my career, I have observed numerous systems succumb to the march of technological progress, but I have never witnessed obsolescence occur this suddenly or this completely. The question facing the world today is not whether these losses can be replaced, but whether replacing them even matters. We must ask if rebuilding a traditional armored force makes operational sense in a strategic environment where that force can be neutralized before it ever engages, targeted by an adversary with a virtually unlimited capacity to produce the very weapons that achieved its destruction. My assessment is that it does not. The operational framework that has organized ground combat since the early 20th century has encountered a technological development it cannot survive without a fundamental, systemic restructuring. This is the new reality of the battlefield. If this analysis has provided you with the necessary strategic clarity, I invite you to leave your assessment in the comments below. Share this briefing with those who need to understand this new era of warfare, and subscribe for further deep dives into the shifting architecture of global security.